of all, thank you all so much for being here with me. It means a great deal to have you share something that means so much to me and that I've spent so much time learning about and working on. I begin with a question which guides all historians who study the Holocaust, which is how did it come to pass that 6 million Jews were murdered in Germany, the nation which was the birthplace of some of our greatest philosophers, poets, theologians, and artists. Jews have been murdered many times in masses throughout history, but the Holocaust is different. The final solution almost succeeded in eradicating the Jews from this world. It seems more than an outburst of anti-Semitism. In hoping to avoid a repetition of this surreal horror, historians have sought out the origins of the Holocaust. Many historians find genetic and biological science culpable for creating the necessary ideological and bureaucratic conditions for the total elimination of the Jews. They have understood the jargon of Nazi speeches and their calls for race hygiene, the cleansing of the racially inferior elements of society, to actually indicate the importance of racial science for the Holocaust and in radicalizing racial ideology. Thus, my research question is, what was the bureaucratic and ideological utility of racial science in the Third Reich? The first line of the front cover of the United States Holocaust Museum's publication Deadly Medicine states, from 1933 to 1945, Hitler's Nazi regime attempted to implement its vision of a biologically healthy, ethnically homogeneous community, an Aryan master race. This exhibition examines Nazism's roots in biology and genetics dating back to the early 1900s. The scientific breakthroughs, therefore, are a foundation of the Holocaust, a factor differentiating it from previous attempts to murder Jews. This thesis began as a feeling of dissatisfaction with historical proof of science's ideological input and bureaucratic function. I aimed to discover more specifically how scientific inquiries led to the genocide of the Jews. The question which guides my thesis is thus this one. My findings and their implications radically departed from the current consensus among historians. Nazism's roots did not grow from the biological and genetic sciences of the early 1900s, but from the long and entrenched tradition of European anti-Semitism. In my methodology, I analyzed primary sources according to a novel distinction which has not been made before, within the category of race hygiene. Race hygiene, the cleansing of inferior traits, is broken down into two subcategories: racial empiricism and medical eugenics, which you can see in the red boxes. Racial empiricism examines all documents investigating distinctions between races. Medical eugenics examines and is categorized as all experiments pertaining to hereditary diseases. Non-racial empiricism includes all other scientific biomedical science in which racial categorization was irrelevant. And finally, thanatology denotes all experiments which seek the boundaries of human survival. These were brutal and cruel experiments that tested the human capacity for withstanding certain infectious diseases in certain extreme conditions. The first portion of my thesis is a large-scale quantitative analysis of the science conducted within Nazi Germany. I examined 478 unique documents submitted for the USA versus Karl Brandt medical trial, and I coded them according to racial science, thanatology, medical eugenics, and non-racial empiricism. This methodology is novel in two regards. First, to my knowledge, there has never been this sort of large-scale quantitative analysis of science done in Nazi Germany. Second, I introduced a novel distinction within the category of racial hygiene. In part two, I analyzed the financing of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute of Anthropology to determine what science was supported financially by the Nazi regime. This has implications about the regime's perception of the utility of the science being conducted. In part 3, this is an example of the Excel spreadsheet I used to categorize the documents. In part 3, I analyzed the most famed works of German racial science. This includes Hans Gunther, and it includes Human Heredity by Bauer, Fischer, and Lenz. I analyzed their theories and their empirical studies to determine if the work they did contributed to radicalizing racial ideology. And afterwards, in my analysis, I examined racial science documents in the context of the National Socialist legal system to determine their bureaucratic function. On my section on findings on racial and non-racial science, one thing is certainly clear. The results of the USA versus Brandt document analysis was decisive. The blue on this graph denotes all the documents which were categorized as racially empirical, while documents in the categories of thanatology, medical eugenics, and non-racial empiricism were numerous. Only 16 of 424 documents were categorized as racially scientific. However, each of the 16 documents is only merely indicative of racial anthropological investigations occurring. They indirectly suggest the existence of racial science through terms like anthropological investigations, but there was not a single instance of direct evidence for a large-scale racial study taking place. Therefore, even these 16 documents fail to conclusively demonstrate the existence of racial science within concentration camps. To briefly explain this point further, let us examine some specific documents that are seemingly proof of the importance of racial science. One document which outlines the purpose of the Ahnenerbe, an SS institution dedicated to the investigations of, quote, space, spirit, accomplishments, and heritage of the Indo-Germanic peoples of the Nordic race, end quote. This document states that its mission includes assignment of research work and conduct of research expeditions and publication of scientific work. Dr. Wolfram Sievers, the director of the Ahnenerbe, mentioned in his journal Anthropological Work at Auschwitz. Another document written by Dr. August Hirt on the topic of creating a Jewish skull collection states, quote, by procuring the skulls of the Jewish Bolshevik commissars who personify a repulsive yet characteristic subhumanity, we have the opportunity of obtaining tangible scientific evidence, end quote. On the face of it, these documents support claims of the importance of science in radicalizing racial thought. However, there is not a single instance of actual empirical investigations into race. The vast majority of documents concerning Dr. Sievers and Dr. Hirt have nothing to do with race. Rather, they conducted brutal thanatological and anatomical dissections and experiments. Although some people were initially designated with racially scientific tasks, it is not clear from the evidence that they actually followed through on conducting those experiments. We can deduce from their abandoning racially scientific endeavors that they valued other sorts of science more highly. This empirical result has powerful implications for understanding the utility of racial science as understood by the scientists and doctors working within the concentration camps. The minuscule quantity implies that racial science was significantly less important than other biomedical fields, and the high probability that racial science was abandoned by those initially designated with conducting those experiments further strengthens this claim. Historians have not distinguished between racial science and medical eugenics. And for this reason, they have been misled in their analyses of the prevalence of certain scientific practices. Given this new graph combining racial science and medical eugenics under the category of racial hygiene, it is understandable why this error would be made. As we now know, well, it seems in this case that racial hygiene was very important, perhaps even more important than the pathological studies going on at the time. As we now know, this result is very misleading. The financial information of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology, Human Heredity, and Eugenics indicates very similar results. In the early years of the Third Reich, the funding for the KWIA doubled. As the chart shows, there was heavy funding of this organization until 1940, when requests began to be denied. As World War II came to dominate life in Germany, all resources were directed towards the war effort. For the next 2 years, KWIA funding was sparse. In 1942, there was another shift. The KWIA was classified as indispensable to the war effort, and funds began to flow once again. The shift occurred because the activities of the KWIA moved away from ideological reiterations of Nazi racial thought towards investigations which were actually useful. For example, the study of the heritability of tuberculosis. The evidence so far supports the argument that Nazis themselves did not find racial science useful. It is for this reason that it was neither prevalent nor supported in the later war years. This should make us reconsider understanding racial science to have been useful in altering and entrenching radical racial ideology. If it wasn't that important, it is likely that my findings would reveal more racial science. That said, racial science did exist in Germany. The next part of my research examined the works of Hans Gunther, the most prominent racial theorist of the 19th century, and of Bauer, Fischer, and Lenz. Human Heredity by Bauer, Fischer, and Lenz is described as the standard textbook on racial hygiene and is widely understood to be the paradigmatic text on German racial science. Firstly, looking at Gunther's conclusions about Jews, it is clear that his conclusions reinforced traditional stereotypes. Gunther's work uniformly exhibits three faults. First, there is very little empirical evidence for his racial claims. Most of his conclusions came from broad speculations about the movement of races throughout human history. He has pictures of typical members of each race, but has no large-scale analysis or measurement of racial traits. Second, he gives no causal theory, linking the criteria for being categorized as a member of a race to the traits that the race tends to exhibit. And thirdly, and most importantly, he presupposes a biological notion of Judaism wherein Judaism is a hereditary trait that can be passed down to offspring. Therefore, all Jews are a hereditary category and can be treated as a single natural kind, just as any species can. There is never any attempt to defend this stance. This fault is shared by the authors of Human Heredity. The hefty 700-page paradigmatic text spends most of its time reiterating Mendelian genetics. For this reason, it seems more scientific than Gunther's work. However, on the few pages that they do talk about race, the authors invoke the exact same speculative historical method that Gunther uses. Their results are equally stereotypical. Near Easterners, a term they used for Jews, have a less masculine mentality than the Nordics. Jews are particularly empathetic, they write. Traditionally, it was believed that Jews' capacity for empathy made them especially good parasites, since it enabled them to blend into their host populations. Their stereotypical conclusions were not supported by empirical evidence. Bauer, Fischer, and Lenz shared the same fundamental flaw that Gunther made. They understand race to be a biological category, and the members of that race to be unified as species are unified. This point is very important, and it is at the crux of why racial science is not ideologically useful. To demonstrate the presupposed notion of race even further, consider a survey of all people living in Germany in 1933, based on the qualities that Gunther describes as naturally Jewish. Earlier sexual maturity, nose size, thick lips, etc. Before one can make conclusions about these traits, about the Aryan and Jewish populations, one must first designate each person as either Jewish or Aryan. If Jews and Aryans are already understood to be natural kinds, then the societal and legal designation quickly becomes a biological one. This is indeed what was done, since the societal designation was very clear. Labeling someone as Jewish was even stated explicitly by Fisher to be obvious and nearly impossible to mess up. Without this assumption, however, one would have to identify a specific trait to categorize people as either Aryan or Jewish. Due to the genetic variety of the Jewish population, in practice this would mean excluding some people with Jewish ancestry from being called Jewish. This was politically unacceptable and against the traditionally established racial dogma. Moreover, the conclusions drawn about those in each group would not be in virtue of being Jewish, but rather in virtue of having the trait that was used to determine the group in the first place. The notion of Jews as a single biological kind was identified as the factor which caused Nazis to conclude that the only possible solution, the final solution, was a complete annihilation of the Jewish species. Supposedly this is what biological and genetic sciences gave to Nazi racial ideology. This is what resulted in Nazis murdering 6 million Jews. However, the idea of Jews as a natural kind was always assumed in the first place by those conducting racial science. It is thus impossible that it was generated by those empirical investigations. And therefore, racial science was a mere reiteration of long-held anti-Semitic beliefs rather than their ideological generator. Doing this portion quickly. It is also clear that racial science did not play a crucial bureaucratic role in the actual racial designation of people. This document illustrates the legal formality with which Jewish identity was determined. 3 or 4 Jewish grandparents made someone a Jew, 1 or 2 made someone a Mischlinge. There are no physical qualities which ever factor into this determination. Of the 49 documents between 1935 and 1945 I examined in the USA versus Brent trial documents, there was not a single example of Jews ever being legally determined or determined in any way by physiological or psychological characteristics. There were no examples of this. So while there has been extensive historiography on both sides of this issue, they have recently been at an impasse, unable to discern what about the Holocaust came from history and what from modernity. This work in showing that racial empiricism was neither extensively practiced nor supported contributes evidence to the argument that empirical science played a very weak role, if any. Historians must therefore revise their arguments to be more nuanced. No longer can an unqualified science be pointed to as the culprit for the radicalization of racial ideology. Race hygiene must be seen as the outcome of historical traditions rather than empirical investigations into race. By finding scientific inquiry responsible for the Holocaust, as do many contemporary historians, one can mistakenly conclude that today, since our science has become so advanced and our grasp of nature so detailed, we are somehow protected from the factors which brought about the destruction of the European Jews. One might think that the numerous scientific articles which proclaim race to not exist protect us from racial radical ideology. This is false, and this is dangerously misleading. Science may have contributed efficient tools for execution, for sterilization, but the motivation and the ideology necessary for the Holocaust was born from an entrenched history of European anti-Semitism. Its roots run deep within European society today, scientific breakthroughs notwithstanding. Thank you very much. If anyone has questions, I'd be happy to. Yes?
There's a famous exchange with Goebbels, the open secret being that it's a Jewish man who starts both Lufthansa and the Luftwaffe. And Goebbels is asked, how can you let this happen? And his response is, I decide who's a Jew. I'm wondering whether you looked at some of the politics surrounding the certain aspects of this, in as much as the politically charged nature of defining that was quite crucial in separating Aryans from others. Does that need a scientific basis, or could that stand alone as a political explanation?
So excellent question, and I couldn't agree more. Basically, I think that the fact that if you actually understand what it means for Jewish identity to be scientifically based, for it to be based around a certain cluster of traits, it's completely politically unacceptable. It's completely contradictory with the established dogma. There was a lot of politics surrounding sometimes who could be qualified as a Jew, who couldn't be qualified as a Jew. It's not so much with the people who had 3 or 4 Jewish grandparents, but in the case of Mischlinge, the case of people who had 1 or 2 Jewish grandparents. Oftentimes, if they had enough money, they could go to the ancestry bureaus and pay enough money, or if they had connections, they could get qualified as an Aryan. Say, this person's a Jewish grandparent, but really he's not Jewish. That said, the number of Jews who were killed, who were sectioned off into the concentration camps, was so vast that someone could never have the practical political authority to actually designate enough people as Jews or non-Jews to come to a situation where that many Jews and that many people are legally categorized in each category. So basically, in some cases, even though Goebbels could say, oh, this person's my son's nephew, he's not Jewish, there had to be a very clear and simple legal system in place for this many Jews to be legally categorized in the way that they were. Other questions? Did I convince you? Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.